So just to reinforce the concepts, what's moving air in during inhalation and what's moving air out during exhalation is the change in the thoracic volume or the change in the lung volume. When the lung volume increases, because the ribs go up and the diaphragm moves down due to contraction, the air pressure in the lungs drops versus outside, and then that draws air in. When the ribs drop and the diaphragm moves up, because the muscles that move the ribs and the diaphragm, which is a muscle, relaxes, that decreases thoracic volume and decreases lung volume. That increases air pressure in the lungs versus the external air pressure, and that moves the air out. Okay, let's look at how the brain can control or controls breathing. So breathing is an autonomic or automatic process. You don't have to think about it. For example, when you're asleep, you continue to breathe. So usually nerves in the brain, control centers in the breathing, control centers in the brainstem, part of the brain, maintain and control a resting breathing rate of about 10 to 14 inhalations and exhalations per minute. Resting breathing rate. So the rate can vary, for example, during exercise, stress, etc. So the stimulus for increasing the breathing rate could be an increase in carbon dioxide levels in the blood due to exercise. That causes the breathing control centers to increase the breathing rate by sending signals to the muscles that control the ribs and the diaphragm to contract faster and or more forcefully to increase the breathing rate and the depth of breathing, meaning how much air is brought into the lungs. Okay? So the carbon dioxide increase in the blood is detected by blood carbon dioxide monitoring in a few of the blood vessels in the body, and that signal is sent to the brainstem. So if you're late for the bus, late for school, late for a date, late for the bathroom, and you start to run, you're exercising, that drives cellular respiration to increase at the muscles, the tissue levels, and that leads to increased carbon dioxide levels in the blood. That's detected, and that signal is sent to the breathing control centers in the brain, and then those breathing control centers in the brain, in the brainstem, send signals to the muscles of the ribs and the diaphragm to contract faster and more forcefully to increase the breathing rate. How many breaths per minute will go up, and the depth of breathing, pulling in more oxygen and exhaling out more carbon dioxide with each breath. Then once you stop and you relax, the breathing rate will continue elevated for a while, but then it'll start to slow down and get back to the resting breath rate or breathing rate or respiratory rate. So the role of hemoglobin in gas transportation, again, we talked about, excuse me, the human respiratory system takes oxygen into the body and expels carbon dioxide. We've talked about those processes, and the respiratory system depends on the circulatory system to move the gases between the lungs and the cells, right, via the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit based on need. So oxygen does not readily dissolve in blood, so blood has the red blood cells, which are full of hemoglobin molecules, approximately 250 million hemoglobin molecules for each red blood cell. So the hemoglobin molecule is made up of 4 separate polypeptide chains that are linked together and 4 iron atoms in what's called the heme group. And actually each one of them, each iron in the heme group, latches onto an O2, an oxygen molecule. So each hemoglobin molecule can actually bind 4 oxygens, which means, and since there's 250 million of these per red blood cell, each single one, can carry up to a maximum of 1 billion oxygen molecules. Remember, these are tiny, but that's a lot. Remember, red blood cells are totally modified and specialized to transport oxygen via the hemoglobin molecule. So the hemoglobin binds oxygen in the lungs, we talked about that, transports it through the blood, because the hemoglobin molecules are in the red blood cells, and then unloads that oxygen at the body's cells at the capillary beds. We've talked about that as well. And then we've also mentioned the insufficient amount of red blood cells is referred to as a condition called anemia. So the shortage of iron, like dietary iron, can lead to less hemoglobin being produced. Not necessarily less red blood cells, but that is also linked to insufficient amount of red blood cell production. So the iron deficiency is the most common cause for anemia. Lack of oxygen delivery to our tissues and cells. And that is it for this chapter.